Imagine stepping into a grand, shadowed estate where the past refuses to die. A place where whispers slither through the halls, mirrors reflect someone who isn't there, and the man who hired you sees not you, but the woman who came before. When Evelyn Carter takes a nursing job at Blackwell Manor, she expects to care for a grieving widower. She doesn't expect to become his dead wife. But as she's forced to wear Eleanor's dresses, mimic her mannerisms, and live in her ghost shadow, Evelyn begins to question what's real. Eleanor drowned, or so they say. But there is no grave, no body, only secrets buried beneath the mansion's walls. And someone, or something, wants Evelyn to uncover the truth. What happens when you step into someone else's life and can never step back out? The carriage rattled over the rain-slicked road as Evelyn Carter peered out at the looming structure ahead. Blackwell Manor stood at the edge of the cliffs, overlooking a restless sea. The sprawling estate was a testament to wealth and power, yet something about it felt suffocating. The gray stone, the high arched windows like unblinking eyes. It was as if the house itself was watching. Evelyn adjusted her gloves, nerves tightening in her stomach. The journey had been long, and the generous salary had tempted her more than she cared to admit. A position tending to a widower in mourning wasn't unusual, but the circumstances surrounding Victor Blackwell were unsettling. His wife, Eleanor, had drowned less than a year ago. Her body never recovered. The tragedy had turned him into a recluse, shrouded in mystery. The carriage halted before the grand iron gates. As Evelyn stepped down, the cold air bit through her coat. A figure in black approached, an older woman with a severe face and piercing gray eyes. "Miss Carter, I presume?" "Yes," Evelyn answered, squaring her shoulders. "I am Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper. Follow me." The woman led her through the gates, across a cobbled path flanked by statues of angels, their features weathered and sorrowful. As they reached the manor doors, Mrs. Whitmore turned abruptly. "There are rules in this house, Miss Carter. I expect you to follow them without question." Evelyn nodded, but a prickle of unease ran down her spine. Inside, the manor was grand yet strangely lifeless. Chandeliers hung in eerie stillness, their crystals catching the dim candlelight. Gilded portraits lined the halls, their subjects' expressions frozen in judgment. Evelyn's footsteps echoed on the polished marble floor as Mrs. Whitmore led her up a grand staircase. The scent of lavender and something faintly metallic lingered in the air. "You will meet Mr. Blackwell now," Mrs. Whitmore announced as they reached an intricately carved door. "Speak only when spoken to." Before Evelyn could respond, the door creaked open. Victor Blackwell sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace. The flickering flames cast deep shadows across his angular face. He was striking, dark hair slightly disheveled, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to pierce through her. But there was something else in his gaze, something unsettling. He rose, moving with deliberate grace. "Miss Carter." Evelyn curtsied. "Mr. Blackwell, it's an honor to be here." His lips curved in a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Tell me, have we met before?" Evelyn frowned. "No, sir. I don't believe so." Victor studied her for a moment longer before murmuring, "Strange. You remind me of someone." Evelyn didn't need to ask who. She already knew. The morning air in Blackwell Manor was unnervingly silent. Evelyn had spent her first night in a guest room with high ceilings and dark wooden furniture that felt oppressively large. She had barely slept, the storm outside rattling the windows, or perhaps something else had disturbed her, a whisper beneath the wind. At breakfast, Mrs. Whitmore outlined the household rules. "You will attend to Mr. Blackwell's needs personally. He dines alone at precisely 7. The West Wing is off limits. You are to remain in your quarters after dusk." "Why?" Evelyn asked. Mrs. Whitmore's gaze was cold. "It is simply the way of things." Victor did not appear for breakfast, and Evelyn found herself wandering the house. She drifted through rooms with dust-covered furniture draped in white sheets, portraits of long-dead ancestors whose eyes followed her every move. In the grand library, She ran her fingers over the spines of leather-bound books, pausing on one with Eleanor's initials embossed in gold. As she pulled it from the shelf, something fluttered to the ground. A letter, its edges yellowed with age. Evelyn picked it up and unfolded the delicate parchment. If anything happens to me, know that it was not an accident. I fear I will not make it through the winter. He watches me even in my sleep. Her breath hitched. Was this Eleanor's handwriting? Miss Carter. Evelyn jumped, the letter nearly slipping from her fingers. Victor stood in the doorway, watching her with unreadable eyes. She forced a smile. Mr. Blackwell, I didn't hear you come in. He stepped closer, glancing at the book in her hands. His expression darkened. That belonged to Eleanor. I'm sorry, Did you read it? His voice was dangerously soft. Evelyn hesitated. Only the first few lines. Victor exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. She wrote often, but not all her words should be trusted. Evelyn studied him, unsure what to say. Do you believe in ghosts, Miss Carter? The question was so sudden, so unexpected, that she faltered. I'm not sure. Victor's lips twitched as if amused. Then you may change your mind soon enough. Before Evelyn could respond, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the dimly lit library, Eleanor's letter still clutched in her hands. The words echoed in her mind. If anything happens to me, know that it was not an accident. Evelyn woke to the sound of the sea crashing against the cliffs. The storm had passed, but the air in Blackwell Manor remained thick with an unshakable tension. As she dressed, she replayed the words from Eleanor's letter in her mind. If anything happens to me, know that it was not an accident. Descending the grand staircase, she found Mrs. Whitmore waiting with a bundle of folded garments in her arms. These are to be yours, the housekeeper stated, her expression unreadable. Evelyn hesitated before taking the clothes. The fabric was finer than anything she had ever owned. Delicate lace, silk blouses, and long skirts with intricate embroidery. But something about them fell off. As she ran her fingers over the stitching, she realized. These belonged to Eleanor. Mrs. Whitmore nodded. Mr. Blackwell has requested you wear them from now on. Evelyn's stomach twisted. The implication was clear, but she forced herself to remain composed. I have my own dresses, she said carefully. They will no longer be necessary. The finality in the woman's tone left no room for argument. That evening, Evelyn presented herself at dinner wearing one of Eleanor's gowns, a deep blue dress with pearl buttons. The weight of it was suffocating, as if she had draped herself in the past. Victor sat at the head of the candlelit dining table, his sharp eyes tracing over her. You look familiar, he murmured. Evelyn swallowed hard. These were Eleanor's clothes. Yes, he said simply, taking a sip of wine. They suit you. Uncomfortable, Evelyn turned her attention to the meal. But Victor wasn't finished. Tomorrow, we shall begin refining your posture, handwriting, and manner of speech. Eleanor had a grace about her, something that can be learned with patience. Evelyn froze, her fork hovering midair. I was hired as a nurse, she reminded him. Victor smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made her skin crawl. And yet, you've already become so much more. A chill ran through her spine. That night, she examined herself in the mirror, trailing her fingers along the silk of Eleanor's dress. For a fleeting moment, it was as if someone else's reflection stared back at her. She shuddered and turned away, the whisper of a memory, "You remind me of someone," echoing in the darkness. Sleep was elusive. Evelyn tossed and turned, haunted by the overwhelming feeling that she was losing herself piece by piece. By morning, she resolved to learn the truth. If she was expected to become Eleanor, she needed to understand who Eleanor truly was. She spent the day exploring the manor, slipping through shadowed hallways and quiet corridors. Many rooms were empty, abandoned to dust and time. But one door stood out, a heavy oak door at the end of the west wing. The door was locked. Miss Carter. Evelyn whirled around to find Mrs. Whitmore watching her with a hard gaze. This wing is forbidden, the housekeeper warned. Why? Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. It is Mr. Blackwell's private space. You would do well to respect that. Evelyn knew when not to push, but the question burned in her mind. That evening, she lingered in the library long after dinner, poring over books that once belonged to Eleanor. It was there, among the faded pages, that she found another letter tucked between the covers. This one was different from the first, longer, more frantic. I have tried to leave, but I am watched. The walls whisper my name, and I feel the house itself swallowing me whole. If I am gone, do not believe what they tell you. The truth is hidden where the light does not reach. Evelyn's hands trembled. Before she could process it, the sound of soft footsteps broke the silence. She turned just in time to see a figure move past the library doors. Her heart pounded. She hurried after it, stepping into the dimly lit hall. Nothing. Just shadows stretching across the marble floor. Then she saw it. The oak door to the west wing slightly ajar. Swallowing her fear, she stepped forward, nudging it open. The room beyond was swallowed in darkness, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw something that made her breath hitch. A large, ornate mirror stood in the center of the room, and reflected in its surface, standing right behind her, was a woman in a white gown. Evelyn spun around. No one was there. A gust of cold air whispered through the open door. Then, slowly, as if guided by unseen hands, the door creaked shut and locked. Evelyn was trapped. The darkness pressed in around her. Evelyn's breath hitched as she turned, hands scrambling for the door handle. She twisted it, rattled it, pushed and pulled, but it refused to budge. A whisper of cold air traced her skin, though no windows were open. She swallowed hard. It's just an old room, just an old mirror. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been standing behind her. With trembling fingers, she reached for the single candle on a nearby table and struck a match. The dim glow flickered against the heavy furniture draped in dust covers. The mirror stood in the center of the room, its frame ornate, its glass impossibly smooth. There was no woman now, no reflection other than her own. She took a slow breath. Stay calm, think. She stepped further inside, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. Shelves lined the walls, filled with trinkets, books, and small portraits. A collection of dust-laden relics. But as she ran her fingers over them, she noticed something strange. Each item belonged to Eleanor. A hairbrush with delicate silver inlay. A locket she had seen in one of her portraits. A book with her name scrawled inside the cover. It wasn't a forgotten storage room. It was a shrine. A metallic taste filled Evelyn's mouth as she backed away. Victor had preserved this space exactly as Eleanor had left it. A gust of wind sent the candles flame guttering. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed midnight. Then a sound. Not the wind, not the house settling. Something else. A faint rustling like fabric shifting. Evelyn's head snapped toward the mirror. The reflection had changed. She was still there, but the background had shifted. Now the room in the mirror wasn't as it was in reality. In the glass, the furniture was uncovered, the fireplace was lit, and someone was sitting in a chair at the far end of the room. A woman, dressed in white. Evelyn's stomach clenched as she forced herself to look at the chair behind her. It was empty. The reflection was a lie. A sudden click. The door creaked open. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She blew out the candle and ran. She didn't sleep that night. By dawn, she decided to visit Dr. Callahan. When she arrived at the village, she found his office tucked away between a tailor's shop and a bakery. A brass bell jingled as she pushed open the door. Dr. Callahan, a man in his 40s with graying hair and sharp eyes, looked up from his desk. "Miss Carter," he greeted. "I expected you sooner." Evelyn froze. "Why?" He gestured for her to sit. "Because no one stays at Blackwell Manor without feeling its weight." She hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair. "You knew Eleanor," she said. It wasn't a question. Dr. Callahan folded his hands together. "I was her physician for years." and I was one of the last people to see her alive. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She was afraid, wasn't she? The doctor hesitated. Yes, very much so. Did Victor? She stopped, uncertain if she could voice the question aloud. Dr. Callahan's lips pressed into a thin line. I cannot say what truly happened, but I will tell you this. Eleanor came to me the week before she disappeared and said something that still haunts me. He leaned forward. She told me the house wanted her gone. Evelyn shivered. Dr. Callahan sighed. Leave, Miss Carter. Whatever you think you're searching for, you won't find anything but ghosts. But Evelyn knew better. There were things in that house that weren't just memories. And she wasn't leaving until she understood what they were. That night, Evelyn returned to Blackwell Manor with Dr. Callahan's words circling in her mind. The house wanted her gone. Victor was absent at dinner, leaving her alone in the cavernous dining hall with nothing but the sound of the ticking clock. She barely touched her meal, her thoughts fixated on the locked room. Someone had let her out. Someone, or something, had opened that door. A storm brewed outside, the wind howling through the trees. Evelyn excused herself early and ascended the staircase, her candle flickering with each step. As she reached the top, she paused. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, coming from a hallway just ahead. She turned sharply, expecting to see a servant, but the corridor was empty. The footsteps continued, slow, measured, moving toward Eleanor's old room. Evelyn's heart pounded. She followed, her pulse thrumming in her ears. The footsteps led her past the library, past the portrait hall, toward the West Wing. Then, silence. The corridor was still. No movement, but the door to Eleanor's room was open. The storm outside raged, lightning flashing through the windows, casting elongated shadows on the floor. Evelyn hesitated. Then, slowly, she stepped inside. The room was cold, as if untouched by time. Everything was as it had been the day Eleanor left. An unmade bed, a book left open on the nightstand, a vanity mirror with a silver hairbrush resting upon it. She swallowed. It's just a room. Then, something caught her eye. In the reflection of the vanity mirror, something moved. Evelyn turned sharply. Nothing. Her breath came shallow. She turned back to the mirror. This time, she saw them. Footprints, appearing one by one on the dust-covered floor, moving toward her. She stumbled back, her throat closing around a scream. The footprints stopped just a few feet in front of her, then slowly turned and walked away. The air in the room thickened. Then, a whisper. You shouldn't be here. Evelyn bolted. The morning air was thick with mist, swirling around the estate like silent phantoms. Evelyn woke unrest, her mind clouded by the memory of the footprints and the whisper that still clung to her ears. You shouldn't be here. But she was, and leaving wasn't an option. Dressing quickly, she made her way to the dining hall. To her surprise, Victor was already seated at the long mahogany table, sipping his morning coffee as if nothing in the world was amiss. He looked up when she entered, his gaze unreadable. You didn't come to breakfast yesterday, he remarked. Evelyn forced a smile. I went to the village. Victor set down his cup, tilting his head slightly. To see Dr. Callahan, I presume? A shiver ran through her spine. He said it as if he already knew. She nodded carefully. I wanted to ask about Eleanor. For a long moment, Victor said nothing. Then, finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. What did he tell you? Evelyn hesitated. That she was afraid. Victor exhaled, his lips twitching into something that was not quite a smile. Eleanor was prone to dramatics. She wrote letters, Evelyn countered. She wrote that she felt she was being watched, that she feared she wouldn't make it through the winter. Victor's gaze darkened, but his voice remained smooth. Eleanor had a delicate mind, Miss Carter. She saw shadows where there were none. Evelyn clenched her hands beneath the table. She didn't believe him. Victor sighed and stood, walking to a nearby cabinet. He retrieved a small box and set it before her. Open it, he instructed. Evelyn hesitated, But curiosity won. She lifted the lid. Inside, folded neatly, was a delicate pearl necklace. Eleanor's. "Put it on," Victor murmured. Evelyn's pulse quickened. "I don't think." "I insist." Her fingers trembled as she clasped the necklace around her throat. Victor's eyes gleamed with something dangerous. "Perfect." Evelyn suddenly felt like a doll, being dressed and placed exactly where Victor wanted her. And that terrified her. Later that evening, as Evelyn wandered the halls, she came upon a door she had never noticed before. The door to the art gallery. She stepped inside, the scent of oil paint and aged canvas filling her lungs. The room was filled with paintings of Eleanor, portrait after portrait, each capturing her in different moments. Sitting in the garden, gazing out at sea, reclining in the library. But as Evelyn moved closer, her breath caught in her throat. One of the paintings was unfinished, and it wasn't of Eleanor. It was of her. Her likeness had been captured in exact detail, the same curve of her jaw, the same arch of her brow. It was dated weeks before she had even arrived at Blackwell Manor. Evelyn's stomach turned. Victor had been expecting her. Evelyn couldn't shake the unease that clawed at her skin. She barely ate at dinner, her mind spinning over the unfinished painting. Why had Victor painted her before he had even met her? As the grandfather clock chimed 11, she made her way to the library. She needed answers. She scoured Eleanor's old books, running her hands along the spines, looking for anything she might have missed. Then, her fingers brushed against something unusual, a small slit in the lining of the bottom shelf. Carefully, she pried it open. A folded letter fell into her hands. The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink remained dark. The edges were stained with blood. Her heart pounded as she read. "Victor is not the man he pretends to be. He is watching me. He is waiting. He says he will never let me go. If I disappear, do not believe the lies. He is not grieving me. He is celebrating." The letter was signed, Eleanor Blackwell. A sharp creak sounded from behind her. Evelyn whipped around. The library doors had drifted open. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And in the dim glow, Evelyn saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the corridor. Not moving, just watching. Victor. Her breaths caught. The letter trembled in her grip. "You shouldn't be here so late," he murmured, stepping forward. Evelyn quickly stuffed the letter into her pocket. "I was just reading." His smile was slow, deliberate. He was too close now, too aware. "You spend a great deal of time looking through Eleanor's things," he mused. Evelyn forced a laugh. "It's a fascinating house." Victor reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You're becoming quite like her, you know." The breath in her lungs turned to ice. "Go to bed, Miss Carter," he whispered. Evelyn barely made it to her room before she collapsed against the door, her chest heaving. Her fingers brushed against the letter in her pocket. Victor was not grieving Eleanor. He was celebrating, and she was beginning to understand why. Evelyn barely slept. Victor's words still echoed in her mind. "You're becoming quite like her, you know." And the blood-stained letter in her pocket was proof that Eleanor had feared for her life. By dawn, Evelyn had made a decision. She needed to find Eleanor's grave. If she could confirm that Eleanor's body had been buried, then at least part of the mystery would be settled. But as she began her search, she encountered an unsettling truth. There was no grave. She combed through the family cemetery behind the manor, searching for any marker bearing Eleanor's name. She found Blackwell's from generations past, but no Eleanor. Her hands clenched at her sides. Victor claims she drowned. If that were true, perhaps there had been no body to bury. But then, where was the memorial? Where was the proof that she had ever existed? Something wasn't right. Later that evening, Evelyn found herself drawn back to the locked room in the West Wing. She hesitated before the door, breath steadying. It had opened for her before. Would it again? As if on cue, the door creaked. Not open, but unlocked. Her fingers trembled as she pushed it inward. The room was as she had left it, dusty, cold, untouched. The large mirror stood at the center, a silent witness. But something was different. The room smelled strongly of lavender. It was fresh, not the stale scent of a forgotten space. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Someone has been in here. She turned, eyes sweeping the shelves of Eleanor's belongings. Then, in the dim candlelight, she saw something that hadn't been there before. A single white dress, freshly laundered, hanging from a hook on the wall. Eleanor's dress. Her breath came shallow. The implications sent ice down her spine. Someone was preserving Eleanor's memory in real time. Eleanor was either still alive, or someone wanted her to be. Evelyn didn't have time to dwell on her discovery. That night, the household was preparing for a masquerade ball. She learned of it when Mrs. Whitmore knocked on her door, carrying a gown in her arms. "This is for you," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Evelyn's stomach twisted as she unfolded the fabric. The gown was white, lace, identical to the dress she had just seen in the locked room. She lifted her gaze to Mrs. Whitmore. Where did this come from? Mrs. Whitmore hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "Mr. Blackwell's instructions," she said stiffly. A cold dread settled in Evelyn's chest. She had no choice but to obey. The grand hall was transformed by candlelight and music. Guests in elegant masks swayed across the marble floor. The air was thick with the scent of cologne, perfume, and something heavier beneath it. Victor stood near the staircase, a dark mask covering half his face. His gaze found Evelyn the moment she entered. She knew, without a doubt, that she was wearing Eleanor's dress. Victor approached, offering his hand. "Shall we dance?" Evelyn's heart pounded, but she placed her hand in his. The waltz began, their movements sweeping across the floor. Victor's grip was firm, his presence overwhelming. "You remind me of our first ball together," he murmured, his lips near her ear. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She had never attended a ball with him, but Eleanor had. Victor's eyes gleamed. "You were always exquisite in white." She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. The music swelled, and the air grew suffocating. The walls felt closer. The chandeliers burned brighter. Evelyn gasped as she caught her reflection in the grand mirror at the edge of the ballroom. It wasn't her own face staring back at her. It was Eleanor's. A whisper touched her ear. "You're dancing with a ghost." Evelyn's knees buckled. The world spun. Darkness swallowed her whole. The world swam around Evelyn. She wasn't sure how long she had been unconscious, but when she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the ballroom. She was in her bed. Her dress had been changed. Someone had placed a damp cloth on her forehead. She bolted upright, breath ragged. The masquerade, the mirror, Eleanor's face staring back at her. It had felt so real. A soft knock at the door made her flinch. Dr. Callahan stepped inside. "You're awake," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. Evelyn stared at him, her pulse still erratic. "What happened?" "I found you collapsed in the ballroom," he said. "Victor told the guests you were simply overwhelmed, but I thought it best to bring you here." Evelyn's fingers curled around the bedsheets. "Dr. Callahan," she whispered, "am I losing my mind?" The doctor hesitated before pulling a chair beside her bed. "Tell me everything." And so, she did. She told him about the letters stained with blood, about the footsteps appearing in Eleanor's room, about Victor's growing obsession. She told him about the locked room, the dress that had been left out for her, and about the reflection in the mirror that hadn't been her own. When she finished, Dr. Callahan exhaled deeply, rubbing his temple. "I was afraid of this." Evelyn's stomach twisted. "Afraid of what?" He met her gaze. "That you were becoming Eleanor." The words sent a chill through her. Dr. Callahan sighed. "I never believed Eleanor simply disappeared. I was the last person to see her alive, and she told me she planned to leave the manor for good. She was desperate. But then, one night, she was gone. Victor claimed she drowned, but there was never a body. No funeral. Just absence." Evelyn swallowed hard. "You think Victor did something to her?" "I don't know," he admitted. But I do know this. Victor doesn't grieve Eleanor. He is preserving her. Evelyn's fingers dug into the sheets. Everything he does, Dr. Callahan continued, the way he dresses you, the way he watches you, it's not a mistake. It's by design. He is shaping you into the woman he lost. Evelyn's breath came shallow. She had felt it. The way Victor's eyes lingered, the way his touch was too familiar. Miss Carter, Callahan said gravely, I fear that if you do not leave soon, you will become Eleanor in more ways than one. A slow dread seeped into her bones. She needed to get out, but she knew, in the depths of her soul, Victor would never let her go. Sleep eluded Evelyn. Dr. Callahan's warning gnawed at her, but she felt trapped. Victor was always watching, and now, with the weight of everything she had learned, fear coiled in her chest like a living thing. When she finally drifted into restless sleep, the dreams came. She was standing on the cliffs, the sea roaring below. The wind lashed at her gown, Eleanor's gown. A voice called her name. She turned and saw Victor standing at the edge. You must jump, he said. Evelyn shook her head. No. Victor stepped closer. It's the only way. You have to be her. Her breath caught. I'm not Eleanor. Victor's lips curled into something dark. Aren't you? Then, suddenly, hands at her back, a force pushing her forward. Evelyn screamed as she fell. The icy water swallowed her whole. She woke with a gasp, bolting upright in bed. Her nightgown was damp with sweat, her skin freezing. The dream had felt so real. She forced herself to take deep breaths, to shake off the lingering terror. But as she glanced toward the vanity mirror, her stomach dropped. A single word had been traced into the fog glass. Jump. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. She stumbled out of bed, heart hammering, and grabbed a cloth to wipe the mirror clean. But no sooner had she erased the word than a whisper drifted through the room. You shouldn't be here. Evelyn spun around. The room was empty. Her breaths came ragged. She backed away from the mirror, her thoughts racing. She had two choices. She could run, or she could fight. And something deep inside her whispered, she wasn't done fighting. Evelyn's world had shrunk into two options, run or fight. But before she could act, she needed to know the truth. She needed to speak to Mrs. Whitmore. The housekeeper was the oldest presence in Blackwell Manor. She had seen things, knew things, and she was the only one who might tell Evelyn what she needed to know. She found Mrs. Whitmore in the conservatory, tending to the ivy curling up the glass walls. You shouldn't be here, the housekeeper said without looking up. Evelyn stepped closer. Tell me the truth. Mrs. Whitmore's hands stilled. About what? Eleanor, Evelyn pressed. About what really happened to her. You were here when she disappeared. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then, finally, Mrs. Whitmore exhaled. I tried to help her, she murmured. Evelyn's stomach clenched. Help her? Mrs. Whitmore turned, her eyes dark with something unreadable. She wanted to leave. Evelyn's breath caught. She was planning to escape, Mrs. Whitmore continued. She had everything ready. Her bags were packed, her letters written. She was going to board a carriage before dawn and never look back. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. But she didn't. Mrs. Whitmore nodded. Because that night, she vanished. Evelyn swallowed. Victor says she drowned. Mrs. Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. Do you believe that? The question hung between them, sharp and unyielding. No, Evelyn admitted. The housekeeper studied her for a long moment, then whispered, Neither do I. A chill slid down Evelyn's spine. You need to leave, Miss Carter, Mrs. Whitmore urged, her voice tight with urgency. Before it's too late. Evelyn hesitated, but she couldn't leave yet. Not until she knew everything. Not until she uncovered the truth about Eleanor. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. Mrs. Whitmore's words haunted her. She wanted to leave. She vanished. Neither do I. If Eleanor hadn't drowned, then where was she? She found herself wandering through the dark corridors, candlelight flickering against the aged wallpaper. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and salt. Then, she saw it, a figure, draped in white, standing at the far end of the hallway. Eleanor. Evelyn's breath came shallow. She knew she should turn away. She knew she should run, but she didn't. She stepped forward. The figure moved, drifting toward the cliffside gardens. Evelyn followed. Her pulse pounded as the cold wind howled through the trees. The figure glided ahead, its presence surreal, almost not human. Then suddenly, it stopped, right at the edge of the cliff. Evelyn's heart lodged in her throat. The figure slowly turned. For the first time, she saw the face. It was Eleanor, pale, hollow-eyed, lips parted as if trying to speak. Evelyn gasped, stepping back. Eleanor. A gust of wind tore through the cliffs. The figure swayed. Then it was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there at all. Evelyn stood frozen, her breaths ragged, her mind spinning. Had she seen a ghost? Or was Eleanor trying to warn her? One thing was certain. Eleanor's story wasn't over, and neither was hers. Evelyn couldn't shake the image of Eleanor standing at the cliff's edge, her pale lips parted, as if trying to speak. Was she trying to warn her, or was she something else entirely? Morning arrived, bringing heavy clouds that cast the manor in an even darker gloom. But Evelyn had already made up her mind. She needed to find out where Eleanor went the night she disappeared. If there was no grave, no body, then there had to be something left behind. She spent hours searching through the library, through the parlor, even through Eleanor's old wardrobe. And then, she found it, behind an old trunk in the dressing room, a loose floorboard. Her pulse thundered as she pried it open with trembling fingers. Beneath it was a key, a heavy, black iron key. She stared at it, heart racing. This wasn't just any key. It belonged to a locked door. That night, she searched for where it might fit. She tried the library, the study, the west wing. Nothing. Then, deep in the halls near the old servants' quarters, she found a door she had never noticed before. A plain wooden door, almost hidden in the shadows of the corridor. She held her breath and slid the key into the lock. It turned. The door creaked open. A cold draft met her as she stepped inside, candlelight flickering against damp stone walls. A narrow staircase descended into the dark, a hidden chamber. Her breath came shallow as she moved forward, her candle illuminating the path. The air was heavy, suffocating. Then, suddenly, the scent of lavender. She stopped. A single candle flickered at the end of the passage, revealing a small room. And in that room was a bed. The sheets were disturbed, like someone had been sleeping there. Evelyn's skin prickled. Was Eleanor alive? She turned toward a small desk in the corner. Letters. Notes written in Eleanor's handwriting. Some old, some newer. She reached for the most recent one, unfolding it with trembling fingers. It read only 3 words. Help me, please. A gasp left her lips. Then, a creak behind her. The candle snuffed out. Darkness swallowed her whole. Evelyn froze. The air was thick, pressing against her like unseen hands. She wasn't alone. Somewhere in the dark, someone was breathing. She fumbled backward, her fingers brushing against the rough stone wall. "Who's there?" she whispered. Silence. Then, a whisper. "You shouldn't have come." A rush of wind slammed the door shut. Evelyn let out a strangled cry, her candle useless in the darkness. She stumbled forward, hands outstretched, searching for the exit. Then, a soft sound, a sob. She turned sharply. "Who's there?" she demanded again, her voice shaking. Silence. Then movement. A figure shifted in the corner of the room. The dim glow of a dying candle barely illuminated the silhouette of a woman in white. Eleanor. Evelyn's breath caught. Eleanor. The figure shuddered. Then, a flash of candlelight caught her face. Evelyn's stomach dropped, because it wasn't Eleanor. It was herself, her own reflection, distorted, hollow-eyed, and wearing Eleanor's dress. Evelyn screamed. The room spun, her vision blurred. A voice whispered in her ear, "You are becoming her." And then, darkness. Evelyn woke with a jolt. She was no longer in the hidden chamber. She was in her bed, but she didn't remember how she got there. The last thing she recalled was the figure in the dark, the whisper in her ear. "You are becoming her." Her head throbbed as she sat up, her body aching as if she had been carried, dragged, back to her room. A shiver ran down her spine. Who had brought her here? She turned toward the vanity mirror, expecting to see her own reflection. But she saw Eleanor. Not just a flicker, not a trick of the light. Eleanor stood behind her. Evelyn spun around. Nothing. Her breath came in gasps. She was unraveling. Or was she? The letter. The secret chamber. Eleanor was alive. She had to be. Evelyn rose, pushing away her fear. She had to make a choice. Run or fight. And something deep inside her whispered, this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about ending it. She had to find Eleanor before it was too late. The corridors of Blackwell Manor felt like a maze of shadows as Evelyn made her way back toward the hidden chamber. She carried a candle this time, her grip tight around the brass holder. The walls felt closer, the air thicker. When she reached the door, she hesitated. What if she wasn't alone this time? What if Victor had been the one to take her back to her room? Her stomach twisted. She couldn't turn back now. Taking a steadying breath, she pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was undisturbed. The letters gone. Every trace of Eleanor's presence had been erased. Evelyn's heart pounded. She wasn't wrong. She knew what she had seen. Had someone moved Eleanor? Had she escaped? Or had Victor found her first? A rustling noise made her freeze. She turned sharply, just in time to see something move in the darkness. A figure. It lunged. A hand clamped over her mouth. Evelyn struggled, panic clawing at her chest. Then a voice. "Be quiet." The grip loosened just slightly. She turned her head, eyes wide. It was Mrs. Whitmore. Evelyn gasped for breath. "Who are you?" "You need to leave." The housekeeper's face was pale, her expression urgent. "He knows." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "Knows what?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice dropped to a whisper. "That you are no longer afraid of him." Mrs. Whitmore's grip was firm as she led Evelyn through the hidden corridors. "You have to run, Miss Carter," she whispered, "before he finds you." Evelyn's pulse pounded. "What about Eleanor?" "I found her letters, her room. She was here." Mrs. Whitmore halted. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, she never left this house. Evelyn's breath hitched. "Then where is she?" The housekeeper hesitated. Then, finally, she whispered, "The cliffs." The storm had broken over the estate by the time Evelyn reached the cliffside garden. Lightning sliced the sky. The wind howled. Somewhere beyond the crashing waves, Eleanor was waiting. Victor's voice stopped her in her tracks. "You never should have come here." Evelyn turned sharply. He stood just beyond the trailing, his face obscured by shadows. But she could see the gleam of his eyes. "Where is she?" she demanded. Victor stepped forward, a slow, deliberate movement. "She was weak," he said simply. "She tried to leave me." Evelyn's pulse thundered. "So you killed her?" Victor's lips curled. "Did I?" Lightning flashed. For a brief moment, she saw something move behind him, a figure in white. Victor didn't notice. His gaze was locked on Evelyn, his expression filled with something dark, something triumphant. "Tell me," he said, stepping closer, "do you believe in ghosts now?" Evelyn's heart stammered, because as another bolt of lightning lit the sky, Eleanor stepped into the light. Evelyn's breath hitched as Eleanor stepped into the light. The wind whipped her white gown, rain soaking the delicate fabric. Her long, dark hair clung to her face, her eyes hollow but alive. Victor staggered backward. For the first time, fear flickered in his expression. "You." His voice caught. "You're." Eleanor tilted her head. "Disappointed," she whispered. Victor's face twisted. "You're dead." Eleanor's lips curled. Am I? A bolt of lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating everything. Evelyn could barely breathe. Eleanor was alive. She had never left the estate. She had never drowned. Victor had locked her away. The hidden chamber. The letters Evelyn found. She had been waiting for the right moment. And now, it had come. Victor's face darkened. You should have stayed dead, he growled. Eleanor's eyes glinted. So should you. She stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his. I know what you did, she whispered. Victor stiffened. You trapped me, she continued, her voice shaking with fury. You wanted me to disappear. You made everyone believe I drowned. Evelyn's hands clenched into fists. Why? She demanded. Why did you do this? Victor's jaw tightened. Because, he hissed. She tried to leave me. The storm raged around them, waves crashing below. I loved you, Victor said through gritted teeth. I gave you everything, and you still wanted to run. Eleanor's face hardened. You never loved me, she said softly. You wanted to own me. Victor's eyes darkened. I made you. Eleanor's expression turned to stone. Then you made a mistake. And with that, she stepped closer. Too close. Victor lunged. Evelyn screamed. But Eleanor was faster. She sidestepped him at the last second. Victor stumbled forward, his footing lost on the slick grass. For a single, terrible moment, he teetered at the edge of the cliff. His eyes locked with Evelyn's. Then, he fell. Victor's body disappeared into the storm. The crash of waves swallowed any final scream. For a moment, Evelyn and Eleanor stood frozen. Then, Eleanor exhaled. It was over. She had won. Evelyn took a shaky step forward. You're alive. Eleanor turned to her. Thanks to you, she said softly. The weight of everything came crashing down on Evelyn. The whispers, the mirror, the letters hidden beneath the floorboards. All of it had been Eleanor. She had been watching, waiting. Evelyn's hands trembled. What happens now? Eleanor smiled, but there was something unreadable in her eyes. Now you get to leave, she said simply. Evelyn's heart skipped. You're staying? She asked. Eleanor turned back to the cliffs, the wind tugging at her dress. This house still has ghosts, she murmured, and I need to put them to rest. Evelyn hesitated, but she knew the truth. Eleanor didn't just want freedom. She wanted vengeance. And Blackwell Manor wasn't finished with its secrets. Days later, Evelyn left Blackwell Manor. She boarded a carriage, watching the estate shrink into the mist. She should have felt relieved, but instead, a single thought lingered. Did Victor really die? No body had washed ashore. No remains had been found. And Evelyn knew Blackwell Manor had a way of keeping its ghosts. As the carriage rolled forward, she glanced down at her hands. Her fingers curled around something cold. A locket. Eleanor's locket. Had she taken it? Or had someone left it for her? A chill crawled up her spine, because inside the locket, carved into the silver, was a single word. Eleanor. But Evelyn had never told anyone her full name. Her breath hitched, because once, long ago, she had gone by a different name, Eleanor Evelyn Carter. She wasn't just becoming Eleanor. She had always been her, and the house had known it all along. Did you enjoy The Substitute Wife? Was there a moment that sent chills down your spine or kept you on the edge of your seat? We want to hear from you. Subscribe to the channel to never miss a new thrilling story. Leave a like if you love the mystery and suspense. Comment below, what was the most impactful moment in the story for you? Was it the eerie whispers, the hidden chamber, or the shocking truth about Eleanor? Got a story idea? We're always looking for new spine-tingling tales to bring to life. Drop your suggestions in the comments. Your idea could be our next chilling masterpiece. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you're the first to experience our next dark and twisted story. Your support keeps the mystery alive.